Haris Narangji. Shall we start the session? Okay. Thank you, dear and respected friend. Thank you so much for your kind participation in today's GSDS Forum Weekly Dialogue. Today, we will discuss about a very important topic, that is on social responsibility of public intellectual. We have with us teachers, I would say, organic intellectuals who inspired many of us towards egalitarian world and gender just society. I, Randhir Kumar Gautam, on behalf of Gandhian School of Democracy and Socialism, welcome respected chair of today's session, Professor Haris Narang, former professor, New Delhi. I extend a very warm welcome to respected speaker of today's session, Professor Nivedita Menon, professor and writer from JNU. I welcome discussant of today's session, Dr. A. Raghu Kumarji, prolific writer, convener of Center for Social Dialogue, Professor Gyan Guloi, Alok Tandonji, Professor Gargi Chakrabarti, Professor Jarnal Singh Anand, and all friends who are present here. I extend a very warm welcome to Professor Anand Kumar and Jayan Tomarji, being a nurturer of Gandhian School of Democracy and Socialism. Let me give a brief introduction to Professor Nivedita Menon. Although she does not need any introduction at all, she is a deep scholar, engaged scholar, both having activist and expert orientation towards political theory, comprehensive politics. She is a feminist, and her writings invites us to engage with feminist insight, political theory, and democratic conceptualizations of world. She is a regular commentator on contemporary issues on collective blog called Kafila. She is one of the founders of Kafila and active in democratic politics in India. Professor Narang trained in JNU. He has more than 50 years of sadhana of research, literature, and translations. He is well known for all of us. He inspires us to look towards decolonizing orientation of knowledge. The topic that is given to be discussed in today's GSDS Forum Weekly Dialogue is very important, because we live in a time where critical thinking at risk, speaking truth to power has become one of the most challenging tasks. And we can see collapse of civic culture and to all these institutions where ideas are foundation or fundamental. We have not only see the crisis of education, but crisis of memory, crisis of history, and crisis of democracy. So the basic thrust of this lecture is to know the possibility of fostering social justice so far as the realm of public intellectual is concerned. So what's the responsibility of intellectual in the time of tyranny? So first I would like to request respected speaker of today's session, Professor Nivedita Menon, to share her reflections on this very topic. Ma'am, over to you.
Me to talk to you all. I don't see this so much a lecture as an attempt to initiate a discussion on this very important issue, because it's important that we all talk about what it means to be an intellectual and so on, whatever that means. So I will make 2 or 3 points, and I hope that we can open up for wider discussion. So the first point is, of course, my first objective is, of course, to question this term intellectual, because it carries with it a certain weight. It carries a certain weight of privilege, the term itself. And so we need buddhijeevi in Hindi, right? I mean, it's a term that contains and expresses a sort of implicit privilege. So we need to think about this term to begin with. Now, I like the way in which Edward Said, in a series of lectures that he did in the 90s, he defined an intellectual as one whose mission is to advance human freedom and knowledge. And Said said that the person or the intellectual whose mission is this, therefore has to stand often outside of society and its institutions and actively disturb the status quo. But at the same time, Said's intellectual is a part of society, and that is how the intellectual is able to address the widest possible public. So I find this is a promising way of thinking about about an intellectual. I think it opens up the term intellectual from its heavy privileged position, and talks about the intellectual as someone who disturbs the status quo in an attempt to advance human freedom and knowledge. Now, one kind of distinction that we make usually when we say public intellectual is between, on the one hand, let's say a scholar or an academic who is linked to some kind of institution like a university. And that scholar or an academic has a very specific field of study. It could be, physics. It could be a subfield of physics. It could be history. It could be economics. So you have this scholar or academic who has a very specific field of study, and that this scholar writes for a narrow audience of other scholars in the field. Now, this work, I think we should recognize as important. It is legitimate. This is the kind of work that produces knowledge, advances knowledge, and to insist that all scholarship should be accessible to everybody is a kind of anti-intellectualism which leads to the kind of fascist programs that we see today, where knowledge is brought to the level of what can be understood on social media. So what I'm trying to say is that there is a kind of scholarship, there's a kind of narrower, focused work in which one addresses other people in the field, and knowledge is developed. And this is legitimate. But the public, what we are calling the public intellectual, I assume in this gathering, is really Said's intellectual. That is the person who disturbs the status quo. But then in that case, when we're thinking of this intellectual in this sense, then we need to think beyond, because you see, when we say intellectual, we imagine someone who sits in a well-appointed study and writes. and then writes in newspapers and so on, and then emerges in the public to make certain weighty pronouncements. And I think I'm trying to take the idea of the intellectual back from that understanding and to think beyond formal of elite institutions like universities when we think of the idea of the public intellectual. And if we think of the intellectual as someone or as those who keep a sharp analytical eye on society and disturb the status quo, then Kabir was an intellectual and Mahadevi Akka was an intellectual. Jyotiba Phule and Savitribai Phule were intellectuals. So I want us to, so the first point I want to make is that it would be interesting for us in this discussion. I haven't come with an answer to this, but I think it would be important to reconsider what the intellectual is. And who is the intellectual? And we know that Gramsci has, and Gandhi used this term, organic intellectual. We know that Gramsci has talked about organic intellectual, so we already have certain kinds of resources to think about that. So let us keep that as one topic that we need to open up, or one theme that we might want to open up this evening. Who or what is an intellectual? And how are they different from scholars or academics? Well, I've suggested a certain difference, but perhaps you might have other ideas. So that is the first point that I wanted to make about intellectuals. Now, it becomes impossible to think at the current moment, or let me not say impossible. I think I want to talk about the university also as a separate theme here, because as it happens, many of the voices, not all, but many of the voices that have been speaking up across the country on different issues have come from the university. So what is the role of the university in producing critical thinking, in producing thought, in producing people who have the capacity to stand up? And I think that we need to think of the university as simultaneously embodying a promise and negating it. What I mean by this is that the modern university is a promise of a space for knowledge generation and transmission, for critical thought and reflection, for freedom of the mind. But the university also reproduces historical privilege. It shores up settled bodies of knowledge. It trains young people to acknowledge authority and to occupy their place in society as it is. So there is a promise of there is a promise which is negated by its functioning, but that subversive promise survives despite its negation. And that is what marks the university more than any other modern institution as a threat to the status quo. We actually see in India the tenacity, the what is the word I want? The resistance of this promise, the holding on of this promise in the public university system, despite relentless attacks over the past decade on it from both neoliberal and Hindu right-wing fronts. And these two strands partially overlap, but they're also distinct. Something happens to and inside universities, which are essentially bureaucratic entities whose job is to produce well-schooled individuals for the world as it is. But despite themselves, there is a kind of explosive combination that the university produces of youth, its disrespect for conventions, and the challenges that access to knowledge produces. That is, the very access to knowledge produces challenge and strength, regardless of the actual functioning of the university, which may well be, which is in fact more often than not elitist and shoring up privilege. So if you look at the Indian university in the late 20th to the early 21st centuries, particularly in the early 21st centuries, we find that universities have been at the forefront of militant resistance to the Hindutva project ever since the current regime came to power. But apart from the Hindutva project, there's a vigorously pro-corporate and neoliberal project. And this project was not inaugurated by the BJP in 2014. It was the previous regime that began the process of structural adjustment in the 1990s. So between 2004 and 2014, the UPA 1 and then UPA 2, which was in the first phase supported by left parties and social movements, continued the process of neoliberal restructuring. And universities were beginning to be restructured along neoliberal lines to produce cheap, educated labor for the global economy. Now, I'm talking about universities here in the context of the public intellectual, because the public intellectual, the term that is used in the title of today's talk, is understood to be someone who can speak truth to power, as it were. Or as Said put it, who can disturb the status quo, who can stand outside and disturb the status quo. Now, we find that there's a way in which the Hindu right wing has still been, it has been challenged quite strongly by people in the public domain who we may or may not want to call intellectuals. That's the jury is still out on the use of that word. For me, I really want us to think about whether we want to use that word. I will continue to use it, but we might want to rethink it. But the element that has not been addressed is this neoliberal restructuring. As I said, universities were beginning to be restructured along neoliberal lines to produce cheap, educated labor for the global economy. And the BJP was only taking forward the UPA agenda on that front. But of course, the UPA was limited because of the democratic pressures of the alliance. It was in the NBA, especially the NBA post 2014 is still not. Students had been at the forefront of protests across the country, especially in the inaugural years of the 21st century, against issues as varied, we will remember, as land acquisition, large-scale displacement by neoliberal regimes, corruption, sexual harassment and sexual violence, gender discrimination, homophobic politics, cutbacks in education budgets, anti-worker policies, and of course, rampant caste-based discrimination. So universities had been at the forefront of this. And if we are to use the term intellectual at all, I think we would have to consider that these protests are coming out of an intellectual understanding of what is happening in the country. So are young students protesting these things? Are they also public intellectuals of some kind? I mean, how are we to think, is the public intellectual only the person who writes and reads? Of course, that is important, writing and reading. But when young people march on the streets and increasingly face police violence, or they face very, very severe disciplinary action for even protesting against a hike of fees and so on, when students march and risk their careers, risk their life, their limbs, I mean, their physical safety, they're already in the university. They could just complete their courses and move on. When they march for the future, are they not displaying a certain intellectual understanding of what education should be? What is the potential of education? Are we not going to call them intellectuals too? Is the kind of question that I'm raising. Now, thanks to the continued expansion of education, reservation policies, and in universities like JNU, affirmative action through deprivation points, the class, caste, and gender profile of these young people is actually quite heterogeneous. So like Rohit Vemla of the University of Hyderabad, there have been others such. There was Richa Singh, the first woman president of Allahabad University Students' Union. Most of them come from, and we could name many people, some of whom are in jail now. But most of them come from modest to extremely poor families, having battled discrimination of different sorts at every stage. Then they enter public universities that are still affordable to many, but soon will not be, but up to now have been affordable to many. These universities, despite the elitism, despite the structural limitations, despite the fact that the faculty is remarkably homogeneous, something like 85% of, I'm not very sure of this exact figure, but this is broadly the range of higher education institution faculty is Savarna, and about 5% is Muslim. But there's this. It's a very non-diverse faculties that we see in universities. But despite all of this, the universities offer spaces of learning, lively debate, intellectual growth, and political understanding of structural injustices. And a good part of this also happens outside classrooms. So something magical, I think, happens in universities, which is young people from marginalized sections see that social transformation is possible and that they can be the agents of that transformation. So it's important to note here that, so I'm just going to take a step back to think about what was the role that public university was supposed to play. It's important to note that they have a long history. Some were set up by the colonial administration to produce Indian administrators and clerks, the universities of Madras, Bombay, Calcutta, and others by rulers of princely states, Mysore, Baroda, and yet others by nationalists, either aspiring to be a modern Western university like AMU or BHU, or a radical alternative like Vishwabharati. Now, after independence, the network of publicly funded universities was deepened and strengthened, a phenomenon not so common among newly independent countries. University education in India is cheaper than school education, a sector in which private institutions, as we know, with high fees predominate. Again, the NEP will destroy all of this. JNU, for example, was especially set up by an act of parliament in 1969, intended to be a university that would, and I quote the Act of Parliament, work to promote social justice and secularism, social responsibility, the composite culture of India, scientific temper, and international understanding, and teach students to be sensitive to the social needs of the country. This was the vision of the university, and I could use all of these attributes to describe what the role of an intellectual should be, of an intellectual. So I'm going to drop public from the term intellectual because as I said, I'd rather use the term scholar or academic for someone who addresses a smaller group of peers, and keep the term intellectual for someone who is in the public. So I think it's a little bit of a it's not necessary to say public along with intellectual. So if you say that a university should work to promote social justice and secularism, social responsibility, the composite culture of India, etc., these are the responsibilities of the intellectual as well, I would say. So that's the close link between the way in which the public university was conceived of at a certain moment in this country. And when you look at the debates in Parliament over this act which set up JNU, the debates in Parliament, I'm just focusing on JNU because it's the university from which I come, but and there has been some interesting work on this act by Aisha Kidwai, colleague at JNU. Debates in Parliament focused on the need specifically to make this university not for the children of the rich, but for the deserving. And JNU's unique deprivation point system has ensured that a diverse and heterogeneous body of students who qualify in the national entrance exam are able to find hostel accommodation and high quality education affordable to most sections. Now, there's been interesting work on the transformations that have been sweeping higher education in India in the last few decades, and one of the interesting pieces of work has been by Satish Deshpande, who says that there's, who has looked at figures and seen that between 2001 and 2010, higher education more than doubled its institutions and raised enrollment by 62%. And this growth, Satish says, is driven from the demand side by a demographic growth of the young in population, by expanded access to schooling, and by larger numbers being able to afford higher education. And on the supply side, higher education has grown largely through privatization. Actually, private sector accounted for a majority of both institutions and total enrollment by 2010. So the NEP will only um, further deepen this process. And then, of course, the second change is, as Satish points out, is the change. There has been a significant change in the socioeconomic profile of those who access higher education. And I think this access to higher education and the heterogeneity of the publics that can access it is the reason for the fact that universities are these vibrant spaces which the current regime is intent on shutting down. So one of the key targets, as we know, of this government has been the disciplining and the policing and the controlling of universities, and basically the ending of critical thinking or even any kind of intellectual work in universities. So if you look at this socioeconomic profile, it used to be overwhelmingly dominated by male urban upper caste students and teachers. But in terms of enrollment, at least women now account for. So there's much greater heterogeneity among students than there is among faculty. Women now account for 42% of total enrollment. And Hindu upper caste men, who were more than 2/3 of all graduates, are now a minority among enrolled students, still overrepresented relative to their population share. And certainly this will go up with the EWS, which, as we know, is basically reservations for upper castes. And rural and first generation entrants have also been increasing. Uh, so now Satish says something very interesting about why there is, such a, obviously this kind of access to education is meant to give people a better life and so on. But he says, Satish says that higher education may be most relevant not for the training it is supposed to impart, which it most often really doesn't, but for the sheer space that it provides. Being a legitimate, if embattled space, it is able to trigger the destabilizing chain of events that, despite the inevitable tragedies along the way, will ultimately bring irreversible change. So, what I'm trying to suggest, and I think I will, I've spoken for over 25 minutes, I think. So I'd like to bring back the discussion to the idea of the intellectual. What is the way in which the university facilitates or restricts the role of the intellectual? Who are we to call intellectuals? To whom do we ascribe this term? And why is it important for those who have the access to public spaces to speak up against any kind of restriction of space for thinking, conversations, social transformation, and structural transformation? And this is a responsibility that everybody has, and everybody tries to fulfill to the best of their ability. But I also want to conclude with one last point before I give it back to you, which is that if we have had the privilege of a permanent job, and this is why, by the way, this is why permanent university jobs, or what in the US is called tenure, is important. Not so that people can live comfortable lives, which is not a bad goal, and I think society should try to make society should give everybody comfortable lives. But the most important reason why a permanent job or tenure is important is because it enables free thought. It enables people to speak and to think and to write and to work without being intimidated by their very life, the possibility of loss of their very livelihood. And this is the reason why there should be permanent jobs in a university, so that there can be multiple forms of intellectual expression. And if we have had this privilege, we have absolutely no choice but to speak up and to stand for social transformation. Thank you.